Laughter echoed through the ballroom as the chair splintered beneath her. Crystal squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the marble floor would swallow her. Then the room fell deadly silent. A shadow loomed, and powerful arms lifted her effortlessly. "You're too heavy," a dark voice growled. "No, she is perfectly mine." Music from a string quartet drifted through the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, masking the ruthless whispers of New York's elite. Crystal Martin stood near the grand floral centerpiece, clutching a flute of champagne like a shield. As the senior art appraiser for Heritage Auctions, she belonged in this room intellectually, yet physically. She always felt like a trespasser. Crystal was fat. Not curvy in the acceptable magazine-approved way, but genuinely heavy, taking up space in a world that demanded women shrink themselves. Tonight, however, she had tried to feel beautiful. She wore a custom emerald green velvet gown that hugged her stomach, her hips, and her thick thighs, a daring departure from her usual shapeless black suits. For a fleeting hour she had actually felt powerful. That was until Gilbert Mitchell arrived. Gilbert was a hedge fund manager whose portfolio was currently bleeding out on Wall Street, though his tailored Tom Ford tuxedo suggested otherwise. He was also Crystal's former fiancé. Their relationship had ended 6 months ago, when Crystal discovered he had been draining her savings to cover his catastrophic market shorts. Worse than the financial ruin was the psychological toll. Gilbert had spent 3 years systematically dismantling her self-esteem, convincing her that no one else would ever love a woman of her size. He approached her now, a predatory smirk playing on his lips, accompanied by a woman who looked like she subsisted entirely on kale water and vindictiveness. "Crystal." Gilbert drawled his voice, carrying just enough volume to attract the attention of the nearby socialites, hedge fund vultures, and gallery owners. "I see you're still indulging. I thought after I left you might finally take a hint and hit a treadmill. But I suppose emerald velvet is one way to disguise a binge." Crystal's cheeks flushed crimson. The surrounding guests, people whose multi-million-dollar art collections she had personally verified, politely averted their eyes while straining their ears. "Leave me alone, Gilbert," she murmured, turning to walk away. "Don't be rude, Crystal. Have a seat with us." Gilbert insisted, stepping into her path and gesturing toward a delicate antique seating arrangement near the wall. It was a genuine 18th century Louis XVI parlor, set loaned by a private collector for the evening's aesthetic. The chairs were famously fragile, constructed of spindly gilded wood and ancient silk. "I'd rather stand," Crystal's, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Nonsense," Gilbert said, stepping closer. He gripped her upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh, and forcibly spun her backward toward one of the chairs. Off balance and caught in her heavy velvet skirts, Crystal stumbled. She fell backward into the antique chair. The sound of snapping wood was deafening. The delicate gilded legs gave way instantly under her weight. Crystal crashed violently to the cold marble floor, a tangle of green velvet, splintered mahogany, and torn antique silk. Her champagne glass shattered beside her, sending a splash of golden liquid across her face and chest. A gasp rippled through the ballroom. Then someone snickered. The snicker dissolved into a chorus of poorly stifled giggles, and finally outright laughter. "Good Lord, Crystal," Gilbert boomed, acting utterly scandalized, while his eyes danced with malicious glee. "You're too heavy for civilized furniture. Did you have to destroy a $50,000 antique just because you lack portion control?" Tears pricked Crystal's eyes. She scrambled to pull herself up, but the velvet was heavy, and her ankle throbbed fiercely from the twisted fall. She felt like a beached whale, a spectacle of humiliation displayed for the wealthiest predators in Manhattan. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the floor to open up and claim her. Suddenly the laughter died. It did not fade away politely. It was severed abruptly, and entirely as if a vacuum had sucked the oxygen from the room. Crystal opened her eyes. The crowd had parted like the Red Sea. Men who commanded multinational corporations suddenly looked at their polished shoes, terrified to make eye contact with the man walking through the center of the ballroom. Daryl Coleman. He was technically listed on the gala's registry as a venture capitalist and philanthropist, but everyone in the room knew the truth. Daryl was the undisputed head of the Cosa Nostra in New York. He didn't break kneecaps. He broke entire geopolitical supply chains. He was 35, built like a heavyweight boxer, packed into a bespoke Brioni suit, with obsidian hair and eyes that possessed the dead cold calculation of a great white shark. Daryl did not stop to greet the mayor or the police commissioner, both of whom were sweating profusely at his presence. He walked straight toward the wreckage of the antique chair. Gilbert, realizing who was approaching, puffed out his chest, attempting to salvage his bravado. "Mr. Coleman," Gilbert stammered, stepping forward. "Apologies for the mess. My ex-fiancée is just... Well, as you can see, she's too heavy for..." Daryl didn't even look at Gilbert. He simply backhanded the hedge fund manager across the face. The crack of Daryl's knuckles against Gilbert's jaw echoed like a gunshot. Gilbert crumpled to the floor, spitting out a tooth and whimpering his Tom Ford suit, instantly ruined by the spilled champagne and his own blood. The ballroom held its collective breath. Daryl stepped over Gilbert's writhing body and crouched down beside Crystal. Up close, his cologne was an intoxicating mix of cedar, dark rum, and expensive leather. His dark eyes swept over her tear-stained face, taking in the trembling of her full lips and the erratic heave of her chest beneath the green velvet. "Are you injured, Crystal?" His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. He knew her name. My ankle," she whispered, utterly bewildered. Daryl nodded once. He slipped one massive, corded arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. With zero hesitation and absolutely no visible strain, he stood, lifting Crystal into his chest as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Crystal gasped instinctively, wrapping her thick arms around his broad neck. "What are you doing? I'm too heavy," she protested, echoing the poison Gilbert had drilled into her brain. Daryl turned his terrifying gaze to the crowd, his eyes daring a single soul to speak. Then he looked down at the woman in his arms. "You're too heavy," he growled, the sound vibrating against her chest. "No, she is perfectly mine. If any of you ever look at her again, I will gouge out your eyes. If any of you speak her name, I will remove your tongues." He adjusted his grip, pulling her softer, larger body flush against his rock-hard frame. "Let's go home, Mia Regina." The interior of the armored Maybach was completely soundproof, creating a suffocating bubble of silence as it sped away from the Pierre and navigated the slick, rain-washed streets of Manhattan. Crystal sat frozen on the plush leather seat, her mind racing faster than the V12 engine. Daryl Coleman sat beside her, radiating a dangerous predatory heat. He had poured her a glass of aged whiskey from the car's crystal decanter and placed it gently in her trembling hand. "Drink," he commanded softly. It wasn't a request. Crystal took a sip, the amber liquid burning a trail of warmth down her throat. The shock was finally beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She was sitting in the private vehicle of a Mafia Don. "Mr. Coleman," she started, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "I don't understand. Why did you do that? And how do you know my name?" Daryl unbuttoned his suit jacket, shifting his large frame to face her fully. His dark eyes mapped the lush curves of her body, completely devoid of the disgust or pity she was so accustomed to seeing from men. Instead, his gaze held a simmering, possessive hunger that made her breath catch. "I know your name, because I know everything about what belongs to me," he said smoothly. "As for why I did it, Gilbert Mitchell is a parasite. Watching him humiliate you was a profound offense to my eyes." Crystal shook her head, the heavy curls of her updo falling around her shoulders. "I don't belong to anyone, and I certainly don't belong to the Mafia." A dark, dangerous smile curved Dariel's lips. "You are incredibly naive for a woman with a genius IQ in art history. Let me enlighten you. Your ex-fiancé Gilbert likes to gamble. He specifically likes to gamble on high-stakes, illegal underground tables run by my associates in Atlantic City. He currently owes my organization $4 million. Crystal's stomach plummeted. Gilbert's financial problems were worse than she had ever imagined. "What does that have to do with me? We broke up 6 months ago." "It has everything to do with you," Dariel replied, leaning closer, his scent wrapping around her senses. "When my men cornered Gilbert yesterday and threatened to break every bone in his body for the debt he offered a trade. He said he couldn't pay the cash, but he could offer us an inside asset at heritage auctions. Someone who could easily forge authentication documents for black market antiquities, allowing us to launder millions of dollars through the legitimate art world." Crystal gasped, horrified. "He tried to sell my career, my reputation." "He tried to sell you, Crystal." Dariel corrected his voice, hardening into steel. "He told my men that you were a pathetic, fat, lonely woman who was still desperately in love with him. He said he could manipulate you into doing whatever we wanted. He offered you as collateral." Tears of hot, furious indignation spilled over Crystal's eyelashes. After everything Gilbert had stolen from her, he was perfectly willing to hand her over to the criminal underworld to save his own skin. The humiliation at the gala was suddenly eclipsed by a profound, agonizing sense of violation. Dariel reached out. His large, calloused thumb gently wiped a tear from her cheek. The contrast between his known brutality and his delicate touch was staggering. "Do not waste tears on a dead man." Crystal stiffened. You killed him." "Not yet," Dariel said calmly. "I prefer my vengeance to be a slow, theatrical process. But when he made that offer, my associates brought it to me. They thought it was a brilliant business strategy. I, however, had a different reaction. The Maybach smoothly descended into an underground parking garage beneath a towering glass skyscraper in Tribeca, 111 Murray Street. The doors had barely opened before 2 massive bodyguards flanked the vehicle. Dariel ignored them, effortlessly scooping Crystal back into his arms, despite her renewed protests that she could walk. He carried her into a private elevator that rocketed upward, only stopping when it reached the penthouse. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling, opulent fortress in the sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of the glittering New York skyline. The walls were adorned with masterpieces, a genuine Modigliani, a stunning Rothko, and hanging prominently above a massive stone fireplace, a familiar 17th-century Caravaggio. Crystal gasped momentarily, forgetting the danger she was in. The St. John the Baptist in the wilderness, it went missing from a private collection in Rome 3 years ago. Dariel gently placed her on a sprawling cream-colored velvet sofa. "You have a good eye, but I already knew that. You authenticated a minor sketch for one of my shell companies last year, a supposed Da Vinci study. You correctly identified it as a 19th-century forgery, despite the seller offering you a massive bribe to sign the papers. You couldn't be bought. Crystal stared at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. She remembered that appraisal. It had nearly cost her her job because the seller was a powerful European aristocrat, but she had refused to compromise her integrity. "I have been watching you since that day, Crystal," Dariel confessed, pacing slowly in front of her like a caged panther. "Your brilliance, your integrity, and yes, your body." He stopped, turning to pin her with a gaze so intense it felt physical. "Society looks at you and tells you that you take up too much space." Gilbert looked at you and saw a vulnerability he could exploit. "But when I look at you, Crystal, I see a goddess of absolute abundance. I see a woman who commands a room, a woman who is soft and warm and entirely real." Crystal's breath hitched. For her entire life, her weight had been a source of shame, a flaw to be hidden under dark, tailored clothing, a reason for men to treat her like a placeholder rather than a prize. Hearing this terrifying, beautiful, lethal man speak of her body with such deep religious reverence was short-circuiting her brain. "You brought me here to use me," Crystal said, trying desperately to cling to logic. "Gilbert sold me to you to launder your money." "Gilbert offered you," Dariel corrected his tone, dropping an octave. "I rejected the deal. I do not force women to commit felonies for my financial gain. I brought you here tonight because Gilbert was going to publicly break you, and I decided my patience had run out. You are not my employee, Crystal. You are not my collateral." He stepped forward, dropping to one knee before the sofa. He reached out his massive hands, gently gripping her thick thighs, through the velvet of her dress, sliding upward, until his thumbs rested on her hips. The sheer strength in his grip was intoxicating. "Then what am I?" Crystal whispered, trembling under his touch. "You are under my protection," Dariel declared, pressing a lingering, burning kiss against the soft curve of her knee. "And you are mine." Morning light flooded the expansive Tribeca penthouse, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. Crystal awoke, nestled among high thread-count silk sheets, the lingering scent of cedar and dark rum, the only immediate proof that the previous night was not a fever dream. Her ankle was tightly wrapped in a professional medical bandage, applied by an incredibly discreet underground physician Dariel had summoned at 2:00 a.m. Beside the bed rested a sprawling mahogany tray. It was laden with fresh, buttery croissants from Balthazar, thick slices of brioche French toast, and a steaming pot of artisanal coffee. Next to the tray sat a sprawling, midnight blue silk robe. It was not a generic, one-size-fits-all garment that would inevitably fail to close over her hips. It was custom draped perfectly for a woman of her substantial, lush proportions. A profound ache tightened in Crystal's chest. For 3 years, Gilbert had policed her breakfasts, replacing joy with dry oats and bitter grapefruit, weaponizing her appetite against her. Dariel, a man who allegedly controlled the eastern seaboard's illicit shipping lanes, had simply provided a feast and a garment that respected her space. She slipped into the robe, the cool silk gliding over her thick thighs and heavy breasts, and limped towards the master suite's double doors. Voices murmured down the vast hallway. Crystal traced the sound to a sprawling glass-walled office overlooking the Hudson River. Dariel stood by a massive oak desk, his broad shoulders tense beneath a crisp white dress shirt. Beside him stood a lean, weathered man in a sharp grey suit, his underboss, Leo. "He didn't just run, boss," Leo was saying, sliding a manila folder across the desk. "Mitchell panicked. He knew you'd freeze his offshore accounts by sunrise, so he sought federal asylum. He walked straight into the FBI field office at Federal Plaza and requested a meeting with Special Agent Richard Caldwell, the head of the art crime team." Dariel's jaw ticked, his obsidian eyes narrowing into lethal slits. "What did that rat offer them?" "The Caravaggio," Leo replied grimly. Mitchell told Caldwell that the St. John the Baptist in the wilderness, stolen from Rome in 2023, is hanging above your fireplace. Caldwell is moving fast. He's pushing a federal judge for a search warrant as we speak. If they find it here, Dariel, they have you on international trafficking and a massive RICO violation. They'll bury you in ADX Florence. Crystal's breath hitched. She instinctively pressed her back against the cold corridor wall. Gilbert was trying to destroy the only man who had ever stood up for her. "Burn it!" Dariel ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. "Boss, it's a priceless. I don't care if it was painted by the hand of God himself." Dariel snarled, his fist slamming onto the oak desk, rattling the crystal bourbon decanter. "I am not spending my life in a cage because of a hedge fund parasite. Cut it from the frame and incinerate it in the private furnace. Now." "No." The word tore from Crystal's throat before she could stop herself. Both men snapped their attention to the doorway. Crystal stood trembling, but resolute, pulling the midnight blue silk tightly around her stomach. Dariel's terrifying demeanor softened instantly. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his large hands gently gripping her shoulders. "Crystal, you should be resting. This is not your burden. You can't burn a Caravaggio," she breathed, looking up into his dark, storm-filled eyes. "It's a masterwork. It's human history." "My freedom is worth more than canvas, Mia Regina," he said softly, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "Mitchell set a trap. I will not be caught in it." Crystal shook her head, her brilliant mind already racing through catalogues, provenance records, and historical anomalies she had memorized over a decade at heritage auctions. She pushed past Dariel, limping heavily into the main living room. She stood before the massive stone fireplace, staring up at the breathtaking chiaroscuro of the saint bathed in shadow and light. "Bring me a step stool," Crystal commanded, entirely forgetting she was issuing orders to heavily armed mobsters. "And a high-lumen UV flashlight, acetone, and a bundle of cotton swabs." Leo looked at Dariel, bewildered. Dariel simply smirked, a look of profound primal pride washing over his face. Get the woman exactly what she asked for. 10 minutes later, Crystal was perched precariously on a velvet ottoman inches from the canvas. Dariel stood directly behind her, his massive hands resting firmly on her wide hips, ready to catch her if her injured ankle buckled. His heat radiated into her, anchoring her, validating her weight and her presence. She clicked on the UV light, bathing the dark corners of the painting in a sickly purple glow. She applied a single drop of acetone to a cotton swab and gently, meticulously rubbed the bottom right corner of the canvas, just beneath the heavy mahogany frame. "Gilbert is an idiot," Crystal whispered, a fierce smile touching her lips. "He doesn't know art. He only knows money." "Explain," Dariel murmured, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, sending a cascade of shivers down her spine. "Caravaggio used a very specific ground layer, a mixture of oil and fine sand, to create his textures." Crystal explained, her voice steadying as she fell into her element. "This painting lacks the quartz reflection under UV light. Furthermore," she rubbed away a tiny layer of 19th century varnish. "Look." Dariel leaned in. Beneath the centuries-old grime, a microscopic, deeply embedded signature became visible under the purple light. A. Dossena. "Alceo Dossena," Crystal said triumphantly, stepping down from the ottoman and straight into Dariel's waiting chest. "The most brilliant Italian forger of the 19th century. He was so good he fooled the Louvre. This isn't the stolen masterpiece from Rome, Dariel. This is Dossena's documented 1892 replica. It's entirely legal to own. It was sold at a public auction in Geneva 12 years ago." Dariel stared at her, utterly mesmerized. He didn't look at the painting. He looked at her flushed cheeks, her sparkling eyes, the brilliant, beautiful mind housed in the lush, soft body he was rapidly becoming obsessed with. "You are extraordinary," he growled. "I can draft an emergency authentication document." Crystal breathed her heart, hammering against her ribs. "Using my official Heritage Auctions seal. When the FBI arrives, they won't find a stolen masterpiece. They'll find a legally owned replica, verified by one of the top appraisers in Manhattan. Gilbert's tip will be proven fraudulent." Dariel's predatory smile returned darker and more terrifying than before. "Let them come." At exactly 15 p.m., the private elevator chimed. The reinforced steel doors slid open to reveal Special Agent Richard Caldwell, flanked by 4 armed FBI agents. Cowering behind them, looking incredibly smug, despite his bruised and swollen jaw, was Gilbert Mitchell. Dariel sat casually on the cream-colored velvet sofa, sipping a glass of scotch. Crystal sat beside him, dressed in a sleek, tailored black skirt and a cashmere sweater Dariel's staff had procured for her. Dariel's hand rested heavily and possessively on her thick thigh. "Dariel Coleman," Agent Caldwell announced, flashing his badge. "We have a federal warrant to search these premises for stolen antiquities, specifically the St. John the Baptist in the wilderness." "Search away, Agent Caldwell," Dariel said lazily, gesturing with his crystal glass. Gilbert's eyes darted around the room, landing on the painting above the fireplace. "There!" Gilbert shouted, pointing a manicured finger. "I told you he's keeping it right out in the open. Arrest him." Caldwell signaled his men, who moved forward to secure the area. The agent turned to Dariel. "Mr. Coleman, stand up. You are under investigation for—" "Before you embarrass yourself, Agent Caldwell, I suggest you read this." Crystal interrupted, her voice ringing clear and authoritative across the penthouse. She stood up, ignoring the twinge in her ankle, and picked up a crisp embossed folder from the coffee table. She walked confidently toward the federal agents, her heavy footsteps grounded and powerful. She handed the folder to Caldwell. Gilbert sneered. "Don't listen to her, Richard. She's his hostage. She's a pathetic, desperate woman who eats her feelings. He's probably threatening her life to cover for him." Dariel was on his feet in a microsecond, his hand drifting dangerously toward the holster beneath his suit jacket, but Crystal held up a hand, stopping him. She didn't need a mobster to fight this battle. She had her own weapons. "My name is Crystal Martin," she said loudly, staring dead into Gilbert's terrified eyes. "I am the senior appraiser of European antiquities at Heritage Auctions. Enclosed in that folder is my sworn, legally binding authentication of the painting above that fireplace. It is not the stolen Caravaggio." Caldwell frowned, scanning the document. "What is it, then?" "It is an 1892 forgery by Alceo Dossena," Crystal stated firmly. "If you turn your UV light to the bottom right quadrant, you will find Dossena's signature, which I have exposed. Furthermore attached are the customs decrystallions and auction receipts from Geneva, proving Mr. Coleman's holding company purchased this replica legally for $700,000. Caldwell pulled a small UV flashlight from his tactical vest, marched to the fireplace, and inspected the canvas. His shoulders slumped. He switched off the light and turned violently toward Gilbert. "You assured me this was the missing masterwork." Mitchell Caldwell barked, his face turning purple with rage. "You used the FBI to settle a personal vendetta. Do you know the penalty for filing a false federal report to trigger a fraudulent raid?" Gilbert paled, his smugness evaporating into pure terror. "No, she's lying. She forged that paperwork because she's in love with me and trying to get back at me." "Gilbert," Crystal said softly, stepping closer to him. She stood tall, refusing to shrink, refusing to make herself smaller to accommodate his fragile ego. You are bankrupt. You are a fraud. And for 3 years you made me believe I was unworthy of love because my body didn't fit into your narrow, pathetic worldview. But I am brilliant. I am powerful. And I am entirely out of your league. Dariel watched her, a look of pure, unadulterated worship on his face. Agent Caldwell, Dariel interrupted smoothly. Since Mr. Mitchell has wasted your time, I assume you will be escorting him out of my home. We will be escorting him into federal custody, Caldwell snapped, glaring at Gilbert. False statements to federal agents. You're looking at 5 years, Mitchell. The agents grabbed Gilbert by his expensive lapels, dragging him toward the elevator. Gilbert thrashed, screaming Crystal's name, begging her to fix it, but she simply turned her back on him. When the elevator doors finally closed, the penthouse fell into a heavy, intoxicating silence. Crystal let out a long, shaky breath, the adrenaline slowly leaving her veins. Suddenly she was swept off her feet. Dariel lifted her into his arms, carrying her over to the velvet sofa. He sat down, pulling her onto his lap so that she straddled his massive thighs. You saved my empire today, Crystal, Dariel murmured, his large hands mapping the lush curve of her waist, the fullness of her hips, pulling her flush against him. I just did my job, she whispered, her cheeks flushing hot as she felt the hard evidence of his desire pressing against her. No, Dariel corrected, his dark eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive fire. You claimed your power, and you claimed me. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her sweet scent. I am a dangerous man, Crystal. My world is entirely dark. But you are my light. You are absolute perfection. Every soft curve, every brilliant thought. I don't just want to protect you. I want to build a kingdom at your feet. Crystal looked down at the man who commanded the city's underbelly, completely surrendering to the heavy, beautiful truth of her own worth. She threaded her fingers through his dark hair, a soft, confident smile spreading across her lips. Then build it, Dariel, she whispered, leaning down to capture his lips. And make sure the throne is wide enough for me. Dariel laughed, a deep, rumbling sound of pure joy, before pulling her down into a bruising, passionate kiss that sealed her fate, not as a hostage, but as the undisputed queen of his empire. If you loved this story of Crystal, reclaiming her power and finding a man who worships every curve, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs a reminder of their worth, and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic, heart-pounding romance stories every single week. Tell us in the comments what you thought of Dariel's ultimate revenge,